I'm thrilled to invite Yves and Daniel back up here. I'm actually here for Yves Béhar, who all of you know about, I'm sure. He's a Swiss designer, entrepreneur, and sustainability advocate. Is really a, working by design and simplifying everything as Apple has taught us and IDEO has taught us. He continues the tradition. He was one of the founders of Jawbone. He was also the founder of August Locks, which is a remote control lock. He's got a consulting firm called Fuse Project, very successful here on 16th Street. Consults for people like Samsung, Puma, Prada, maybe we can get some product out of him, Herman Miller, and to have a very successful practice there. So I'd love to get his perspectives as well. So we'll have a quick sit down with three of us. So Yves, what do you think? What's
Velcro?
Velcro, good traditional stuff. How do you think about what's happening in consumer healthcare? I mean, you're on the lead here with Jawbone. Is this world going to be all consumer health?
So I've been a believer of the space. In fact, if I could only work in that space, I probably would do that. In 1999, I designed a shoe for the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. And amongst all these different big shoe companies, they were like, well, what about a future concept for a shoe? And instead of just doing the next crazy stylistic architectural shoe, I designed one that essentially had sensors in it, and it would give you data about your pronation, about your weight, about how these things change. And then the manufacturer would use that data to make a better product for you, more adapted to your needs, more personal. This was before Bluetooth, before Wi-Fi, before any of these technologies. So you had to remove a chip and send it to the manufacturer that would recycle the shoe. But for me, the most important part here is the relationship. The relationship between a manufacturer and a consumer. The relationship between a doctor and his patient. And I think our relationships currently are just very poor. The relationships between the healthcare system and us, the consumer of that healthcare system, is very poor. The relationship between a hospital and its patients, the relationship between, all those relationships are just, not satisfying, right? And why? It's because there is zero context. So I go into the doctor, once a year, and they have 15 minutes to spend. That's the official figure. They have 15 minutes to spend with me, and they spend 10 minutes asking me how I'm doing. And I tell them, well, I haven't slept really well in the last few, weeks, but I'm doing okay. I mean, it's completely vague and ineffective and useless. Yeah. I mean. On the other hand, if I go into if I go see my doctor and I show him now 4 years of tracking of my sleep, how it changes seasonally, how I'm terrible in the month of February typically, and this is coming out this year again for some reason. If there is better context, and by the way, that context is not just tracking or sensors, which are going to become incredible and go a lot deeper. It's also a mixture of your genetics, a mixture of your blood work, a mixture of your all these elements are also absolutely critical in how you evaluate someone.
Yeah.
Right. I'm actually a test subject in a startup currently called Arival. And Arival is pretty amazing because it takes, it does blood work and it does my biome, saliva for stress, and my genome, and my DNA. And based on this, it says, well, you really shouldn't be doing this, and everything else you're doing is perfectly fine. But the advice that I get is completely different than the advice that you're getting.
Yeah.
Because in my genes, essentially, there are coded predispositions that I have, and there are things I don't have to worry about at all, right? I can eat, I just learned, this is probably not great for me, but I can eat as much as I want, and I will never be obese.
Lucky you.
Yeah, right. That's pretty good news. But I'll get fat, and it's probably not good, but it's, these bits of information, but there's other things that I need to watch out for.
Yeah.
So for me, context, individualized, unique context is probably the most important thing, in healthcare. Everything else really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So health and healthcare really needs to dramatically change if we look at how much we spend on it, if we look at how inefficient it is, if we look at the fact that, as you said earlier, people don't stay on their regimens or don't stay on their their medicine. It has to fundamentally change, and I think we're scratching the surface with wearables and with sort of data, some data and whatnot. But 15 years from now, I can't imagine that it is going to be absolutely radically different, and probably a lot more different than anything else we've experienced to date.
Later on, you mentioned Aravel. I was with Lee Hood last week, one of the co-founders, the father of systems medicine and biology. And today, so much of healthcare is based on little fragmented, intermittent bits of data. What they're able to do, and companies like Human Longevity Incorporated also, are take your microbiome, your genome, your wearable device data, and they're taking, the first set were healthy folks. About 50% of the folks that they evaluated at a deep level, they found out were not, and then found actionable things that they could do. Their mercury levels may have been high, they had a certain gene, and then you could do things to prevent you from getting those diseases later. And part of the challenge for the clinicians as well is we don't know what to yet do with all this information until we start to crowdsource it in a sense and have thousands or millions of people sequenced and the data stream understood. Google's doing this baseline project to understand what is normal. 98.6 is not necessarily the normal temperature for everybody. So it's a really interesting early era, and Aravel's on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
How do you guys think, so you're obviously in fantastic design on the hardware side. Is that, we're sitting here in PCH, is hardware a means to an end? And I want to ask a question subsequently in terms of J&J, when we think about drug companies, because drug companies typically haven't thought of digital health per se. Does it sell more pills right now? But how do you think about hardware? Do you think of it in the same way that, say, Daniel thinks about it, which is, hey, it's a source of data? Or is it something in itself that...
Well, it is there needs to be a purpose, whether it's, time, collecting data or just looking for what time it is.
Yeah.
So there is a certain sensors.
Are these software companies or are they hardware companies? Is the hardware company just building a software company, or think of GoPro, which I think of that as a pure hardware company, but they're transforming into
a media company. Right. I don't think you can be one thing only. Unless you're doing nice jewelry, and in this case, you're a nice, you make nice jewelry, and that's it. But to me, it's a mixture of three things: software, collected by hardware, and as well as. Maybe that's not the third thing, but maybe sort of brand is important because people want to be part of a movement, and if that movement is something that gives them status or makes them happy or makes them look good, that's probably positive. And platform. So for me, whether it's with August or other startups, what I truly believe is you need to be able to have other inputs coming to this data, and you need to be able to serve that data either in partnership with others, whether it's pharma companies or lifestyle coaches or other people who will participate in your health. It's not all going to come from Fitbit or Jawbone or Misfit. Right. It's the points of entry. My needs may require that there's other inputs that go into my results and my customized health and advice. And so for that, you need a platform into which people can input as well as you can contribute and output from that. So those are the three components. I don't think I see any companies that doesn't have all three of those components. That's what I would invest in.
That's good. And do you see the hardware world, is that accelerating in your mind? I guess I'm just amazed at how quickly, I was saying earlier to Stacy that I was at CES and I saw 3 different GoPro ripoffs for, interchangeable parts for $50. And same thing with cell phones. It's shifting, cell phone chips are $35 right now with Qualcomm. I think in 2 years they'll be more like $10. And I just see this thing accelerating so quickly.
Well, there has been in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a return of hardware because hardware has found itself to be more useful. The sensors are better, the battery life is better, the size is smaller. But if you're still going to be on the edge, products are going to cost something, because if you want to do blood pressure today, if you want to do oxygenation tomorrow, et cetera, these, the price point for some of these sensors from some of these new hardware pieces is going to still be fairly high. Yeah. The other thing is, I don't think hardware or any kind of business has succeeded purely by driving down price. Yeah. As we very well know, with the first or second, depending on who you talk to today, most successful, largest market cap in the world company. It is not by driving down into pricing. It's about giving people a great experience. So, Arival, for example, I have a great experience with that company because I get a phone call every month, and I get my full test and lab results every 3 months, and it's ongoing coaching by a real person. And that feels like a high quality service. Yeah. So I think they can charge for quite a bit for that.
Great. Daniel, working as a physician, what's happening in healthcare with respect to this consumerization, or maybe the consumer hardware? All these sensors, as we know from mobile phones, are getting less and less expensive. Do you see that fundamentally shifting?
Talking about hardware.
What happens in healthcare? Yeah. Sorry, you okay?
I think the challenge and opportunity now, as I mentioned really briefly, is that there's so many pieces of hardware and software and apps that no clinician can sort of keep up with them. And I don't want to have to, if you come into my office, I don't want to have to try and upload your Fitbit data or your Jawbone data or your microbiome from Ubiome or 23andMe data. The trick is going to have it start to integrate. And we're starting to see that with, like, as I mentioned, HealthKit is doing some pilots with Epic, one of the big electronic medical records, where I could literally see your scale, blood glucose data, your steps, your sleep information. And that's going to be blended with the incentives for the clinician, who's not going to get paid for every visit, but for keeping you healthier. So if you're a diabetic and have high blood pressure, I could send you home with a connected blood pressure cuff and glucometer and help tune your data, tune your therapy, and I might get a bonus at the end of the year if a good percentage of my patients are doing well, as opposed to showing up in the emergency room every other weekend. So I think those elements are aligning. And we have so many healthcare systems in the US alone. You can do certain things at a Kaiser or a VA where they're the payer player, and others where you need to have the payers, the Blue Crosses, pay for every pill or every device or every app. We're seeing, the replacement of some devices and drugs with apps. You mentioned Omada. There's an app for diabetes, the first FDA-approved prescribable app to help manage blood sugar and the feedback loops.
WellDoc. So
for the clinician, the WellDoc side, is those feedback loops enabled by the hardware, and we need, again, that sort of data dashboard so that the clinician and the patient aren't overwhelmed. And often we need some AI or some sort of machine learning to help interpret that as we increasingly can connect the dots.
One thing that worries me is, especially here in the United States, our current system, the infrastructure that we have in place, isn't exactly easily changeable and willing to change, right? The insurance, the payer system, the pharma companies, the laws, the lobbying, et cetera, makes us actually, in my opinion, one of the slower movers in the field. And the stakeholders are so strong, so big, and nobody's really incentivized towards change besides us, the consumer. We have an incubator. We're supporting an incubator in East Africa, in 3 different countries of East Africa, and I see innovations there that I think are far ahead of what we'll ever see, in the next 10 years here. The ability to have generally easy access to video and phone call, Uber-like, services from doctors, or doctor visitations, is something that you can turn on in a second. Not in a second, but within weeks in some of these places. The fact that they have ongoing, regular, easy payment directly from their cell phone for about everything, with M-Pesa, and that we're still struggling with that here for all kinds of different reasons, sort of is an indication to me that, the lack of infrastructure in some of the developing countries are actually allowing some of these technologies to flourish and to become much more generally adopted than things here. I mean, there's a lot of obstacles, and part of the challenge is, and the bigger challenge isn't so much all the great technologies that Daniel, in hyperspeed presented to us, but how we get these into the hands of consumers without all kinds of barriers going up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
My favorite example of that sort of leapfrog in the US, that company iNetra makes that attachment for eye exams.
Yeah.
They went to India first to pilot it because there's no ophthalmology and optometry lobby there and very few eye doctors. And now they've brought it back with an Uber-like service called Blink, where you press a button and someone comes and does your eye exam. I want to make one distinction though, in this blend between design and technology and hardware and the consumer and the patient. I mean, there's this blend.
Yeah.
A lot of the technologies built today are for the consumers or the worried well. They want to optimize their health, their fitness. But it's a bit different when you're a sick patient trying to come out of that hole, and you need different sort of design elements and incentives built in for that. And
I would argue probably even less friction. Like if you're training and you're motivated, you're willing to put up with a lot of hassle.
Sure, but sometimes, you need to have low hassle, but you're often super motivated to take care of a very acute or damaging chronic disease. And I guess I had a question for Yves. When you built so many beautiful, elegant devices, have you had some lessons that you've learned about the engagement piece, both from the hardware and the software, that would transmit generally?
Well, the first lesson and what got us going, for example, with the Up Band is 24 hours a day is essential. Right, wearability 24 hours a day. So anything that will hamper wrist movement, anything that's too big or heavy or uncomfortable is something that you won't wear at night. And if you only have 50% or less of the data, health data, that's not as useful. So this I think the idea of engagement all the time, hardware supporting that, is essential, and at the same time, it's probably the most challenging thing to think about. How do you put something on people that they wear, whether they have a chronic disease, whether they're real patients or whether they're consumers, that they will wear willingly, essentially their entire life. Those are tremendous challenges from a purely hardware design standpoint that we haven't faced before.
And it goes to the point of personalization, where personalized medicine is moving to precision medicine, and I would argue with both the devices and the hardware and the UI, it needs to be tuned to the individual. Not everyone comes from the Bay Area and has a Fitbit and an Apple Watch. And I think there's an opportunity to do this blended behavioral analysis. When someone's going to come in for optimization or for chronic disease, you can take an intake. What's their personality type, like a Myers-Briggs for behavior change? And they might want a different colored band. They might want points versus badges versus dollars. And some of that can blend and tune and adjust to the individual over time.
You just get your FICO score, like you said. Yeah. Google knows a lot about our behavior. And it's interesting because we can't do that in healthcare. We can't take advantage of it. I'm trying to think about how quickly is this hardware going to change how quickly are we going to get things moved out of the hospital to consumers? Is your sense? Or is it going to stay largely in the hospital?
Well, a lot of the things I mentioned, a lot of things
Chronic.
folks building here are moving things out. The incentive now is never to admit the patient in the first place, or sometimes even admit the patient to home. So you can admit someone with pneumonia to their house with some of these new, might be a pump that's connected for doing their IV medications, or their pulse oximeter that's easy and low cost. There's even a disposable pulse oximeter that just got launched. And so all the incentives are aligning with Obamacare and beyond, that the rewards are going to be for keeping folks out of the hospital, having them admitted as shortly as possible, and not having them bounce back. So a lot of the incentives for, let's say, heart failure readmission is driving everything from the iRhythm to apps that will follow the patient as they leave. And so I think what's incredible is, folks like PCH and others is bringing all these folks who often came from outside of healthcare. Maybe it's the IT world or automobile or gaming, and blending them together and allowing people to prototype and get things into the Kaisers of the world and the Stanfords much more quickly. Even though there's still an issue with pilots, I think we're starting to see folks start to collaborate and blend and
across.
And it's reaching a bit of that tipping point where these are going to become prescribable and flow into the electronic medical record, and the payers are catching on.
I'd say that's just from our own observation. I think healthcare is becoming decentralized, right? We've got minute clinics, we've got CVS, we've got pharmacies, so that part's happening. And I would say it's so hard to change behavior in a hospital that sometimes it's easier just to say we're going to just put this outside the hospital, do it ourselves as a call center, and we'll contract back to the hospital as a service. So there's many examples of that where it's just too hard to get the department chief to agree with the CFO and the CIO and the CEO, and then figure out how the payer is going to pay for it. But I think we should ask a couple questions. So.
Yeah. So we have microphones.
I'm going to ask the first question of Daniel. Do you have some sort of invisible cloak that you were able to hide all of those devices and hold it?
I have more. It's just a regular jacket from, I don't know, Brooks Brothers.
I wasn't sure whether this was a magic act.
No.
Right. He's got a
wait.
rabbit here somewhere.
There's more. No, but that shows you how much medical technology can you fit into a regular coat. Again, many of these things would have been impossible or cost $100,000 10 years ago. And if you knew that the iPhone, 5 came out with that little sensor for your thumbprint, right? How could you integrate that into your future device to let you open a medicine cabinet or a pill bottle or track who someone is? So a lot of these things that were military grade 5 years ago are consumerized and can blend into your current or future products and fit in your jacket.
Who has a question?
Thanks for the talk again. I was wondering, what advice would you have for entrepreneurs in this space to sort of design their product given the regulatory and reimbursement landscapes? Seems like there are a lot of hidden costs associated with collecting a lot of clinical data and things like that are generally not sort of accounted for given just the pure low cost of the hardware for developing the product. How do you sort of, what would your advice be? Thank you.
Talk to Yves or talk to PCH. But I'll give you just a couple. This is very interesting because we deal with the FDA all the time on the device side, right? And it turns out the FDA, with full respect for them, has a very difficult task. Their mission is to not improve healthcare necessarily, but make sure that things are safe. And so when we come with a product and you say it works in 10 people, they're like, it's got to work in 1 million people at 99.99% precision. And so I'm concerned a little bit about the algorithmic approach in getting through the FDA, because if you have an algorithm, you've got to demonstrate that it works for everybody that's going to get this device. If you stick to the 510K process, which is equivalence, a scale, a blood glucose meter, an ECG patch, whatever it is, the FDA is pretty lenient with respect to that. I mean, it works just like everything else. What's very interesting, though, is that just like they do on diagnostics, you can start a diagnostics lab tomorrow, and you can offer any test you want as long as you're CLIA certified. The FDA has nothing to do with that. You can't sell kits, but you can provide that service. Equally, companies like Telcare and iRhythm, Livongo, there's a whole series of them. If you have a hardware sensor, software coming to a trained professional, you can offer a service, and it's completely legitimate. So it needs to be approved hardware that we know it's safe and it's reproducible. But all of the complexity around the data and what do you do with it can be done by, you start with a physician, then you dumb it down, you make it simpler, a nurse can start doing it, and then ultimately you get down to a med tech who does this for $15 an hour.
One other point, I went through the biodesign program at Stanford. It all comes down to unmet need. So before you start building something you think is going to solve a problem, really understand the need from all the angles, the nurse, the patient, doctor, the family, and the regulatory constraints. But don't be completely scared by HIPAA or the current FDA structure, because it is going to shift to some degree. And companies like Uber or self-driving cars would never happen if they said, the regulations don't allow it in today's world. So while you need to be aware of FDA, there's ways to work with them and sometimes even change their regs when it makes sense. So don't be completely hindered by today's world.
Question over here.
To answer my question, I was going to ask about the role of the FDA in innovation. Yves made a beautiful point about how some other companies can go to developing markets where there are not these same barriers and infrastructure and leapfrog technologies. But you guys just answered some of and had some beautiful points about the FDA. So.
I think I just got an email from somebody at the World Bank. They have a whole program to encourage people to submit. I think it's March 6th, they want submissions to do work in India. They've got, I think, 12 hospitals that are willing to pilot stuff. So, and the World Bank will support it. So,
Other questions?
Hi, Greg Biggers, CEO of Compression Kinetics. We make the active compression wrap that Daniel had up there for circulation at rest. So the topic of today's event is the next big thing in healthcare is hardware. And my question is, in what ways is that the same or different from saying the next big thing in healthcare is the Shenzhen commodity ecosystem? So you mentioned, Casper, at CES you saw a bunch of $50 interchangeable GoPro knockoffs. Daniel, you talked about the exponential cost reduction curve and power increase curve happening all over medicine. Benedict Arnold, the mobile analyst for Andreessen Horowitz, has recently been talking a lot about how the smartphone production ecosystem is changing everything in the digital world. But from our perspective, some of us here as entrepreneurs, our mission is to create value, lasting value as a company and value for our shareholders. And so what does that ecosystem look like from your vantage point? How much of this is instant commoditization, and how much of this is there are places where we can capture and sustain value for consumers and for shareholders?
Well, I was meeting with a company today who launched a great fun product, and there was a Chinese knockoff at CES. They had their own booth at CES, and the marshals came in and took that company away. So, which I think a lot of people cheered. But I think the commoditization of the hardware doesn't mean that your company is being commoditized, in my opinion, because the engagement with your consumer and how this particular consumer trusts you or trusts your company with their data, with the information, how you supply them with great advice, individualized advice. These are not easy things to replicate, in my opinion. There are a million different trackers, and I think there's, in my opinion, just one, 2 or 3 that have a decent ecosystem of application insights and ongoing knowledge that is thoroughly being developed. So I think we're actually entering an age where the quality of those relationships is really based on a lot of the things that you're setting up for your company on the service side, on the quality of the experience and the service side, and that isn't something that is easily replicable.
yeah, I'd say it's a race to data and proprietary algorithms. I mean, I don't imagine that you're going to get a Chinese that there are going to be a lot of buyers for a Chinese company to help you manage your diabetes. I'm not trying to be nationalistic. I just think that's a hard one to replicate. So I think of it as, I think hardware is kind of, if from a venture perspective, most venture capitalists don't like to invest in hardware. I'd say the perspective coming from the medical device area, it was only hardware, so I'm less sort of bothered by it. But I do see it as a means to an end, right? So I think the commoditization is actually fine, because I don't think that's where the value is. If you can give me a glucose meter that has a cellular connection that costs $100 to make right now, if you can get it to me for 10, all the better. I'd love to just hand them out for free, honestly, because the value comes from managing that person's diabetes. I see Karen, in a particular case, they have a meter that will actually give you the amount of insulin you're supposed to inject rather than the blood glucose. Great, but that's really hard to do. So I don't see that as something you need to worry about from a defensibility standpoint.
And I just add, across the spectrum from the consumer to patient and the clinician caregiving team. So if you can get in there with the folks who might literally prescribe your compression device for folks who have risk of clotting, to the sports team physicians who kind of set the tone, and often you can get proprietary positioning if you can do a trial and show the outcome. All these things that go to value, if you can show you're preventing strokes and DVTs, it'll get reimbursed eventually.
I mean, another great analogy is, I had this argument with somebody the other night, which is who's going to be the fastest of the self-driving car? I think Tesla is in an amazing position, right? Because somebody's paying, they've sold thousands of cars. People, they're collecting all the data. And Apple or Google has to come out with the perfect car that's going to be the self-driving car the first time. That's a, would you rather get there incrementally?
And they've been on the road with the sort of half self-driving car.
Right.
And the lessons from Tesla here is all those self-driving Teslas are connected, and they learn from each other that this curve is there, that exit you need to take slower. So the software they keep, when they do the do download, everyone gets a better map and a better drive experience. So how can the wearables, the technologies, the hardware you're building sort of all be connected in the learning? So all the toasters are connected. Learn what kind of toast is in there, how much to tune it. Same kind of lesson from Teslas to toasters could be applied to some of these devices and hardware that are going to be increasingly self-learning.
And again, healthcare is incredibly complex. Someone who's a type 2 diabetic that's not just one category. There are insulin-dependent diabetics. There are people who inject once a day, 3 times a day, people who, type 1, type 2, people who are obese and diabetic, people who are thin and diabetic. And those clinical algorithms are different for every one of those patients. So it's a massive amount of customization. When we talk about big data, that's the place where, Watson can't figure this. IBM Watson can't figure this out. It's going to be a long time. And I think the part I'd love to sort of push forward is if we can get hardware cheap enough, it's just get out there, get users, start collecting data.
Eric D., co-founder of Bloom Technologies. Hello.
What's up?
Hi.
So I think building upon that point, I think we recognize that hardware is a means to an end. The value is in the data, and the people that can unlock that value and hit that step function in terms of what does this data actually mean to the user has a huge advantage. And I think the Google self-driving car or the Tesla and the self-driving car and learning that is something that speaks to us. But how do you sort of think about data ownership? Because if the value's in the data, who owns the data then? Does the consumer own the data, or does the company own the data? And is it just as easy? Because I see that we have a hardware device right now, and I see all these just pure software app companies that are trying to create these social networks and platforms. They say, oh, that's great, come in, plug into our network, we'll take all your data. It's like, well, we built the hardware, we did all the hard work, you just want to take all of our data. So how do you think about data ownership in terms of who has it, the company or the user?
Oh, it's a good open APIs or not, right?
Well, I don't know, you're probably better positioned than I am to answer this question, but it seems to me like the data is probably owned by the consumer and by the enterprise. The consumer always has the right to their data. But what you do with that data is the companies, like the algorithms and the knowledge that comes out and the experience and the advice and the insights. Those are impossible to extract out of a single, data point. And I would think that they're hard to extract for a software-only company as well that hasn't been studying, that hasn't been cross-referenced across lots of different users. That's my hardware guy answer.
That's a great question. I don't know if there's a perfect solution, but I think it's a double-edged sword. I think at some point there's a lot of power between unsiloing the data and connecting them in different ways, things that will play with your device well, giving the option to the consumer to own their data. There's a famous case where my friend Hugo has an implantable defibrillator. The company who made his automated defibrillator, Medtronic, wouldn't give him his own raw data, and it's his data. Your genome might be owned by your healthcare company. You might not access it. So there's an opportunity to smartly opt in to share it, and an amazing power when we can cross-fertilize and still provide the value back to the initial manufacturer or inventor. So I think we need new collaborative ways. It's happening now in sort of research science. New England Journal got in hot water. They've talked about data parasites, mining the data that people have published and publishing new things on top. But I think there's a real power there to be able to have smart data scientists extract this and use it in new ways while still rewarding the innovator. And there'll be different ecosystems for that.
Question in the back.
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Sloan. Thanks for having me. I have a quick question. So I kind of sit on the side from, on the polar side, the warfighter and then the civilian, and then in between you have enterprise, patient. in government. So there's tons of hardware. We heard from value. Value is obviously in the data. Value is also in effective hardware. So are you seeing any sort of like new contracting programs, pilots, as you guys said, that are able to facilitate from the civilian back into kind of that defense space? Just because that 5-6 year gap of where the technology was coming out of defense side into consumer is a really fun little switch that's happened. So pilots, consulting, taking in the new products and zipping it back out. Thank you.
Can you read? Was this a statement or was there a question? Sorry. All right.
Is there a particular pilot program that you've seen that's taking in from the consumer and or patient side that's looking at hardware and data to then bring that back into defense, back into the security of the people that live in in the United States? That's where we are.
Gosh, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, I would say
Yeah.
DARPA and others are
Yeah.
funding all sorts of crazy, interesting things, from prosthetic limbs to brain-computer interfaces that are starting to filter down to the everyday, let's say, paraplegic. And there's a lot of cross-fertilization and funding that happens there, from the internet that was funded by the military-industrial complex. But other way around, is it filtering up? Well, I spent 10 years in the military. A lot of consumer technologies, wearables, devices are being bought by the military to take into the field, whether it's a pulse oximeter or the next version of a tricorder. So I think they're adopting these things quickly.
Yeah, I would say that it's very interesting. Israel has some amazing technologies that are, things like gesture, emotion recognition, but that's military to consumer. So those kinds of technologies are being used in terms of talking to patients and saying, is this person upset? Are they amenable? Are they activated? I don't know. We haven't maybe natural language processing at some stage. We'll go the other way around.
Yep. The company you mentioned, Beyond Verbal, the software can tell your mood. We never touched on this here. Huge aspect of healthcare is mental health, and now our hardware, our smartphones, our voice, our social media use are all sensors, biosensors to our mental state, and those can be used for both folks who are on the normal spectrum or have psychiatric disorders. A huge opportunity in that space with hardware and software.
That's a great example, is PTSD treatments. Yep. There's a lot coming out of virtual reality to go back into PTSD treatments for vets. I think that's very much consumer driven.
I think we're going to do one more question right here. She's been patiently waiting. And then after this, we're going to have about an hour where people can mingle and chat and have more open conversations. But we'll have one last question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Landon Steele. All of you touched on, the challenge of going from collecting data to actually changing behavior, right? And the importance of having that coaching aspect and the behavioral psychology part nailed. And I think a couple of people highlighted Lark as doing it AI because that's scalable, but you also made the very good point that maybe, in an interim, you have a real person involved. Can you give more examples of who sort of the leading thinkers are in that behavioral psychology area for training behaviors, and what companies are at the forefront there?
Sure.
Well, I think about 10 years ago, we worked on a project with Novartis about persistence, meaning, you tell people, hey, look, you got to take this pill all the time. If you don't take it, you're going to die. Come see us in 6 months. And they essentially, what they see is patient revolt. People don't take it, whether you told them they were going to die or not. They just want to be their own, they just want to make their own decisions. It's actually, apparently, the older you get, the more you're likely not to follow regimens. Which is an interesting concept. And so persistence is critical, but how do you get to it? I think there's a lot of very interesting software and engagement that comes out of the social networks that we all live in and live through every day. How you get somebody to opt in to something. It may be different today compared to tomorrow, maybe different. Well, how you get me to opt in and say yes to something today based on my mood, based on my activity, based on a tip that you give me today that I find particularly useful is going to be different. So we've had all kinds of ways that we've seen much higher engagement and persistence through gamification, through really interesting particular insights. I think that work is being done, and in fact, that's why I think Silicon Valley is particularly well positioned to be in that field, because so much of the successes here have been about social networks and how you get people to stick with them, and apply that to health and healthcare, and you could go from 30% persistence on certain medicine or certain treatments or certain behaviors to 60, 70, 80%. And that in the world of healthcare is huge, is massive, is a game changer. If we could help Novartis go 10% more persistence, the zeros they add to their profits at the end of in their annual reports are important. That's why they're doing it. Now, this is a different generation of companies that I think is looking at engagement as part of the value that they create, the value of the company that they create, not just something they can charge for, at least not in immediate terms. And so I see a lot of work going on in digital design, user interaction, data, cross-pollination between all these elements of data.
Yeah, there's some great, and there's a great book called Connected, which looks at the Framingham study and the fact that people travel in groups. If your friends are losing weight, you'll lose weight, or vice versa.
Your friends are obese. You're more
Exactly.
likely to be. It's very
So that's a great book. Nir Eyal, there's BJ Fogg at Stanford, who's also terrific thinking about that. I think there's tremendous learning out of, Facebook or Twitter, I think, does literally cohort analysis every week. They look at who joined and what their engagement is over time. And, insights like, if we make it a little bit harder for somebody to sign up, we have less sign-ups, but the people who do sign up stay longer, So all these really kind of unusual behavioral phenomena that I think are very hard to predict. What we see is we've had the experience of trying to deploy something, a solution through the insurance company. They've got massive scale. They got millions of people, right? So you suddenly go, my God, I got 1 million potential users. And it turns out that their net promote, nobody trusts their insurer, right? So when the insurer calls and says, I've got something that can track you, hang up, right? As opposed to very different commercialization strategy, going to your primary care physician, and if your primary care physician says, or your pharmacist is the second most trusted person, says, here, I care about your health, I would consider, like you consider using this, 95% opt-in, as opposed to, say, 5% from an insurance company. And people stick to it very long. But it's a really hard problem. I think when we've talked about with pharma companies, the product managers, if they can move adherence by 1 percentage point, it's worth millions, if not billions. And every time I've interviewed a lot of these people, and they say, yeah, whatever, I said, we move adherence by 10%, forget it. We've tried everything. If you move things by 1 or 2%, I'll genuflect, So it's very hard changing behavior, and I think the best thing you do is just, look for the least friction, and it's all the things we've talked about. Social, caregivers, what's your family doing, what's your physician, I don't know, you see this all the time in healthcare.
Well, if I could prescribe you a GPS for your health, and it might even come from your payer, and it knows, say Daniel, go right to the gym, not left to McDonald's, and you have a lower premium if you're doing your steps and other things, that lever can come into play as well. And I think the ability to change it up, not have the same UI, have different carrots and sticks over time will keep people engaged.
It's not just money, that's for sure.
Any last comments you want to make, or you guys think you've made enough comments, or how do you think? Anything else you want to say at the end? Or should we just say?
I think it's great to see people excited about that, and this is one of the very few fields I've seen where the consumer generally is excited about it. They're eager to see your solutions, startup entrepreneurs, scientists, solutions. They're eager to do things differently, because clearly the way they do things today are broken. And so it's one of these rare moments, rare fields where it's not just about telling somebody, well, go look over there. It's really cool. People are ready. They're attentive. They want to know more about themselves. You know, doctors for a long time were like, well, why do you want to see your file? Why do you, you know, why are you Googling this? You know, why are you searching for your disease? The level of engagements that consumers have today simply by the access of information is tremendous. And, you know, this is a field where we're put into the trust of, you know, the doctors and the system, where now, you know, people simply want to take that back. So it's probably the most exciting field, I think, to be in from a human standpoint, but also from a venture standpoint.
Hopefully. We'll see. We'll know in about 10 years. I mean, just as parting thoughts, thank you to our hosts. You know, PCH and Yves, I think you've got, this stuff is hard. It's really hard to get it right. And you almost never get it right you definitely won't get it right the first time. So it's about iterating and not building a whole lot of infrastructure. It's all about flexible manufacturing, outsources stuff. And we're in a unique place in the world with respect to that. There's so many people who are kind of, you know, try to do this in Germany. I interviewed there once, and the person said, you've changed jobs every 4 years. You're not very stable. That's really, you know, wow. You know, here you can start a company tomorrow, and you can do it virtually, and it's this experimentation, because it's so, I'd say, it's just so complex, and things move so quickly that the advantage we have as startups is moving a lot faster than the incumbents. And I guess on the J&J side, you know, pharma companies, we haven't seen pharma move yet on digital health, so I compliment you for the early look there. But I think it's going to be, I would predict that in 10 years, we're going to see pharma companies providing a solution, you know, taking on rather than just selling pills. I could be wrong on that, but let's hope that they do that.
Well, if they don't, somebody else will.
Yeah.
And people sort of want this healthcare as a service. I think that's going to blend all together. So I echo that it's a really exciting time. It's a really interesting time to bring different technologies into the middle and innovate, but match that with the shifting incentives and the new empowered, engaged consumer and patient who often have really deep needs to use these products. So keep going.
So I'd like to thank our presenters, Yves, Casper, and Daniel.